A Trail of Tears and Death. The Triumph and Tragedy of the Cherokee Nation. Beginning in 1830, with the signing of the Indian Removal Act, the Cherokee Trail of Tears was the forced migration of the Cherokee people, heralding a wave of political consequences, resulting in the Cherokee integrating cultural wisdom with Western practices. It established a precedent for future interaction and negotiation with Native Americans, and is credited with bringing about events that would later dictate the Civil War.
The Trail of Tears was a forced migration of the 5 civilized tribes.
The early 1800s was an era of extreme cultural segregation in the southeastern United States. Cultural and racial superiority was a factor of the growing unrest felt by both Native Americans and white settlers. The settlers considered the Native Americans savage people who occupied land of great financial value that the settlers wanted. The socioeconomic environment was harsh, and many Native Americans were anxious of what was to come. Since many white settlers were starting to voice their opinions about how the Native Americans should be removed, some tribes made early attempts at resistance. The Cherokee, among other tribes, converted to Christianity, learned to speak English, and adopted many of the practices of the settlers. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Creek tribes all used this nonviolent strategy of becoming like the settlers to prevent their possible removal. Because of this, they became known as the 5 civilized tribes. Eventually, the land that the Native Americans owned grew even more financially, and it became coveted by settlers, especially in Georgia, who wanted to cultivate crops. Most of the justifications of the settlers came from the fact that the Native Americans had rich, fertile farmland, perfect for growing cash crops. Some settlers didn't care how civilized their neighbors were, and committed crimes like burning parts of their territory. Even though the resentment between the Cherokee and Georgians had been building, it reached its pinnacle when gold was found on Native American land in 1829. The Georgian government legally tried to drive the Native Americans out of their southern territory. They passed multiple laws limiting the people's rights and encroaching on their land. Andrew Jackson, the United States President at the time, had always believed in Indian removal. He was an Army general and spent years leading attacks against Native Americans. This is a letter from Andrew Jackson about how he thought that it was in the Native Americans' best interest to move west. Jackson's attitude toward Native Americans was paternalistic and patronizing. He described them as children in need of guidance and believed the removal policy was beneficial to the Indians. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act was a piece of legislation that gave the government the power to exchange land owned by the natives for land to the west, in present-day Oklahoma. The territory, which was bought by the United States in the Louisiana Purchase, was unwanted by settlers, especially to grow crops on. The Indian Removal Act required the government to negotiate the treaties fairly, peacefully, and voluntarily. It didn't allow anyone to force the natives to give up their land. The Cherokee tried to fight the government off the same way and went to court. Eventually, the tribe went all the way to the Supreme Court to defend their land and argue their case. Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, one of the court cases in 1831, concluded that the Cherokee were a domestic, dependent nation, and unfortunately could not file suit. This decision was a major setback in the Cherokee's fight against removal. The following year, another case, Worcester v. Georgia, objected to these laws set out by Georgia and claimed that the Cherokee were a sovereign nation and Georgia law did not apply to them in their territory. The Cherokee Nation, then, is a distinct community, occupying its own territory with boundaries accurately described, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. This case, however, was a victory for the tribe. In 1835, some self-appointed representatives of the Cherokee, called the Treaty Party, negotiated the Treaty of New Echota with the federal government, which traded all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi River for $5 million, relocation assistance, and compensation for lost property. They believed that the only way to survive was to move. Many Cherokee people felt betrayed because the party did not represent the whole tribe, but the Senate ratified the treaty despite the knowledge that only a minority of Cherokee had accepted it. John Ross, a Cherokee chief, penned a letter to the U.S. Senate protesting the treaty, and nearly 1,500 Cherokees signed it, but Congress approved the treaty anyway. The actual Cherokee removal process lasted from around 1838 to 1839. After the Treaty of New Echota, only about 2,000 Cherokee had left their home for Indian Territory by 1838, so President Martin Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott and 7,000 soldiers to see out the removal process. Most tribes left their land under threat of invasion by the U.S. Army. The troops forced the Cherokee into stockades at gunpoint, while whites looted their homes. Then the Cherokee and the troops marched more than 1,200 miles to designated Indian Territory. They forced the Native Americans to leave lands they had lived in for generations. Alabama, Arkansas, and Tennessee were all states that the Native Americans went through on their way to their new territory. There were many on-foot trails and camps, along with water routes that about 17,000 Cherokee traveled through. 3 detachments of Cherokee made the journey on boats to their new territory. Most of the natives made the trip on foot without sufficient supplies or food from the government. Many sicknesses found their way with them, including pneumonia and food poisoning, and almost 4,000 Cherokee died on the way. There was much sickness among the immigrants, and a great many little children died of whooping cough. This process continued with the other civilized tribes. By 1839, thousands of Indians had been expelled from the land in the east and forced to relocate to present-day eastern Oklahoma. Eventually, the Cherokee had lost title to over 19 million acres of land. The Trail of Tears was an important factor in the growth of slavery and the increase of population in the Southeast. The United States earned money and business for the economy because of the crops planted by the settlers in the Cherokee's ancestral homelands. Cotton production in the South rose from almost none in 1787 to 3.6 million bales a year by 1860. Because of the trail, the 5 civilized tribes lost 1 in 4 of their population to disease and starvation. However, after the relocation, the Cherokee adapted to their new territory and implemented a system of government based on that of the United States. Almost halfway across the country in Oklahoma, the climate was drastically different, which meant that the Native Americans learned to plant and hunt in different ways. In fact, some of the tribe members that moved away when the government offered them money to acquired enough to start a better living and a new life in Oklahoma. This was a huge benefit for many future generations of Cherokee. The Trail of Tears also strengthened the United States executive branch. Tragically, many of the tribe's cultural practices were lost due to the journey. The settlers continued expanding westward after the Civil War, but as they started claiming more territory, the Cherokee's new territory was taken. Congress then passed new laws, forcing them to live on Indian reservations, and Indian Territory soon became part of the new state of Oklahoma. Eventually, the removal of the 5 civilized tribes opened 25 million acres of land to white settlement and to slavery. Today, only about 2% of the United States population is Native American. However, that is about 2.5 million natives. Throughout the years, the Cherokee have maintained their cultural identity as a tribe.
This is Monty Hall with the Cherokee of Central Florida. I believe that it was a time of great loss. I mean, considering that they're losing, 25% of their population to the Trail of Tears. But I think shortly after, they're such a resilient people that they bounced back, joined together, and they developed, the first schools. Anyway, as far as after they developed the schools, the literacy rate was 90%. By pulling together, they were able to kind of go through a rebuilding period and resume a lot of their traditional ways.
This event altered the reputation of the country that was known to uphold individuals' freedoms with triumphs and tragedies. It was, as one Choctaw leader explained to an Alabama newspaper, a trail of tears and death.